Just give us an overview, an outlook of the financing needs for Africa and whether or not these very easy credit conditions, liquidity conditions around the world, not to mention a rebound in commodity prices, may be helping the continent.
Thank you. What we're finding is we usually do our economic projections for the region twice a year, but given how fast conditions are changing, we've done it. We've done another projection just came out today. And what we show is that the region's economy is expected to shrink by about 3.2% relative to 1.6% contraction we were expecting as recently as April. What this shows is that the region continues to be hit by what's going on globally. And of course, global economic outlook has been weaker than we were expecting just a few weeks ago. As well, the period of containment mitigation has been longer than we were expecting. The end result is this, sharper contraction in output than we were projecting, and this really will be by far the weakest economic performance for the region, going back at least 50 years. So, very difficult year for the region.
So to take Kenya, for example, as one of the major economies set to see its first contraction in almost 30 years, how quickly do you expect the recovery, given that the major trading partners across the region, being Europe and China, are actually seen as two economies that may rebound quicker than the rest of the world?
So, we are indeed projecting a recovery for the global economy. And with that, we expect many of the region's economies to rebound into next year. One kind of source of optimism is that the total amount of COVID cases remains low and has remained low for quite a while. I'm talking about in relative terms to what we've seen elsewhere. And I don't want to suggest that the region is out of the woods. Far from it. I think the cause for vigilance remains very, very clear. But provided kind of the caseloads remain lower than they have been in Europe, in Latin America, in the Middle East, provided this stays and the recovery in the rest of the world takes place, we do feel like playing off that, many countries should be able to rebound in activity next year. And important for this will be sectors like tourism, travel, which are beginning to open up a little bit in Europe, as you know. Hopefully, Africa will follow in the coming weeks also.
How feasible is it to expect a continent like Africa, where there are so many people living in poverty, to effectively shut down their economies?
I mean, that has indeed been one of the challenges that policymakers have faced. Notably, the duration of containment measures has been weaker, and there's been quite a bit of difference between de jure legal measures versus what on the ground has actually happened. And of course, given that safety and the social safety nets remain much weaker in the region or non-existent in many countries, it has, of course, been very difficult for governments to strictly enforce containment measures. That's why we've seen the pressure to ease coming quite quickly before the number of case load increase has flattened. This said, I have to point also to some really very innovative and remarkably supportive new policy measures that countries have been undertaking. You've had countries like Togo, which have adopted, very nimbly new approaches to provide social safety nets. For example, using existing mobile money systems to identify people with low balances, to do some transfers, and many other innovations across the region also.
Abebe, as I mentioned earlier in the show, though, we have seen these record levels of debt for African economies, even before the pandemic hit. I do wonder how much of this debt burden will be hit by the ongoing pandemic, especially given that we have China as Africa's largest bilateral creditor.
It's a very good question. Debt pressures this year will indeed be quite significant. Going into the crisis, we had quite a few countries which had very limited borrowing room and, in fact, had to cut back on public borrowing. Some countries already with unsustainable debts. Now, of course, with the crisis, that problem is even more acute, which is why very early on, the IMF itself moved quite quickly forward to provide debt relief to its most vulnerable members in terms of the debt servicing that were falling due this year. We also, of course, pushed for the G20 debt relief initiative. All of these should create some fiscal space. But one thing I want to stress is that, debt sustainability analysis is something which is very, very country specific. And at this point of maximum uncertainty is not the time to fully understand what's going to be happening in terms of the public debt solvency issues. What is needed really now is breathing space, which is what the G20 debt service initiative will provide. Give countries, basically the fiscal space in the near term, while giving time to next year for us to see how the debt, how debt trajectories will evolve before we can have more sustained discussions.
Does this really indicate that it was a policy error or a misstep to accept this much investment from China? Because essentially what you're seeing is the export of China's own debt burden into the continent.
So, of course, nobody really expected a massive shock such as the one that countries have been hit by just now. So, in doing the projections and undertaking the borrowing, of course, countries were expecting to continue to be able to grow and not expecting the collapse in output and very different path for revenues and other fiscal balances that they're now facing. So that's one mitigating factor. That said, even before the crisis, there were quite a few countries that were struggling to strike the right balance between, on the one hand, addressing their development needs, investing in health, education, infrastructure, and then on the other hand, collecting enough revenues to keep the level of debt sustainable or serviceable. So there were some countries, as we noted earlier, that were under pressure, but those countries also, had time to try and address that. What has happened, of course, is that the shock has, the COVID-induced shock has come in and, in a way, pulled the rug from underneath them.